The email list was right there on the table. Not a rumor, not a leaked document, an official Justice Department email list from the Epstein file release. And when Congress looked at it closely, something became impossible to ignore. 31 victims, named. Their personal information published to the world by the very department that existed to protect them. One perpetrator's associate. Protected. Name withheld. Redacted from the same release. That asymmetry is not an accident. That is a decision. And the hearing on February 11th, 2026 was the moment Congress forced Pam Bondi to sit in a room and explain it. She could not. But before we get to what happened inside that room, you need to understand what was already known before Bondi ever sat down. Jeffrey Epstein ran one of the most documented sex trafficking operations in American history. The FBI investigation that followed his 2019 death produced millions of pages of documents, communications, financial records, and witness accounts. The names inside those files, both victims and the powerful men connected to the operation, had been the subject of legal battles, congressional demands, and public pressure for years. When the Epstein Files Transparency Act passed with bipartisan support and Trump signed it into law, the promise was simple. Release the files. Let the truth land wherever it needed to land. What the Justice Department released was 3.5 million pages. And inside those 3.5 million pages, the pattern was the same in document after document. The people Epstein abused were exposed. The people who may have enabled him were protected. 31 victims, named. One name on the protected list, redacted. That email list became the center of what Representative Goldman brought to the hearing. Goldman came prepared. He had the documents, he had the timeline. And he asked Bondi the question the email list demanded. Why were the names of victims published when the Justice Department had received a specific written request from their own attorney not to publish them? The attorney had sent a list, the department had the list, and then the department published the names anyway. Bondi's answer was process. The releases had been handled according to proper procedure. The department had followed the legal framework. There were logistical challenges in a release of 3.5 million pages. Goldman was not asking about logistics. He was asking about a specific list of names that a specific attorney had specifically requested be protected. The department had that list. The department published those names anyway. That is not a logistical failure. That is a choice that contradicts a specific request from the legal representative of the people the department was supposed to protect. Goldman pressed. Bondi deflected. The room watched. Then came Thomas Massie. Massie had been here before. In the same hearing, weeks earlier, he had caught the Wexner redaction live and watched it get quietly restored within 40 minutes. He came back to this hearing with the same energy and a sharper question. Les Wexner, the former CEO of Victoria's Secret, a man whose name appears in FBI documents as a potential co-conspirator of Epstein's. A man whose financial relationship with Epstein dated back decades and formed the foundation of Epstein's entry into the highest levels of power and wealth in America. His name had been protected. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, a man who had been photographed with Epstein, who had been named in legal proceedings connected to the trafficking operation, who had reached a financial settlement with one of Epstein's victims. His name had been protected. Massie asked Bondi directly. Who made the decision to protect these specific names while publishing the names and photographs of the victims? Bondi said the releases had been handled by career officials following established legal procedures. Massie asked who those career officials were. Bondi said she would have to follow up with that information. The man whose name was redacted from the co-conspirator list and then quietly restored within 40 minutes of being publicly identified. The foreign royal whose name appeared in victim testimony, protected, while 31 American women who had already survived Jeffrey Epstein had their names published to the world without their consent, in violation of a specific written request from their own attorney. Massie named it plainly. The department had created a two-tier system. Victims on one side, the powerful on the other. And the tier you ended up on had nothing to do with what you had done and everything to do with who you were. Bondi said the process had been appropriate. And then Jasmine Crockett walked in with a number. 38,000. That is how many times Donald Trump's name appears in the unredacted Epstein files according to Crockett's research. Not once, not in passing, not as a peripheral reference. 38,000 times, in documents, communications, and records connected to the Epstein investigation. Crockett put it directly to Bondi. The current President of the United States appears 38,000 times in the files your department is responsible for releasing, and approximately 30 pages of those files specifically referencing Trump are still missing from the public release. 38,000 appearances in the files. 30 pages specifically referencing him still not released. Bondi's response was to question the number, to suggest that name searches in large document databases could produce inflated counts due to duplications and references across multiple documents. Crockett said the number was what it was, that it had been verified, that the question was not about the methodology of a document search. The question was about why 30 pages specifically referencing the president remained missing from a legally mandated release. Bondi said all legally releasable documents had been released. Crockett said 30 pages were missing. Bondi said the release had been complete within the legal framework. Crockett said the 30 pages existed and were not in the release. That exchange is worth sitting with because it is not a disagreement about interpretation. It is a disagreement about a specific factual claim. Either 30 pages referencing Trump are missing from the release or they are not. One of those things is true. And the Attorney General of the United States, sitting in front of a congressional committee with legal oversight authority over her department, said the release had been complete. The 30 pages are still not in the public record. Now add the layer that made the entire hearing feel like something different from a policy debate. The survivors were in the room. They had been there since the hearing began, sitting in the rows directly behind Bondi. More than 1,000 victims of Jeffrey Epstein represented in that space, wearing white, watching. And they had written a public letter before the hearing calling the document releases reckless and dangerous. They said the release had placed survivors in jeopardy. They said it sent a message to every future victim of trafficking and abuse that coming forward would not protect you, it would expose you. Representative Pramila Jayapal asked Bondi to turn around, to face the survivors sitting behind her, to look at them and apologize for what the Justice Department had done to them. Bondi refused. She called it theatrics. She mentioned Merrick Garland. She said she was not going to get in the gutter. Bondi had apologized for Epstein in her opening statement. She said she was deeply sorry for what that monster had put his victims through, but she would not turn around and apologize for what her own department had done to those same women last week. This week, in the same news cycle as this hearing, Epstein is dead. He cannot be compelled to face anyone. The people who published victim names while protecting co-conspirator names are alive and employed by the United States government, and the woman who leads that government's law enforcement arm sat with her back to the survivors for 5 hours and called the request to face them theatrics. Here is what the hearing established on the official record. 31 victims were named in the Epstein file release in direct contradiction of a written request from their attorney. The names of Wexner and Prince Andrew were protected in the same release. One redacted co-conspirator name was caught publicly and restored within 40 minutes. Trump's name appears 38,000 times in the files. 30 pages specifically referencing Trump remain missing from the public release. No individual has been named as responsible for the decision to expose victim names. No individual has been named as responsible for the decision to protect co-conspirator names. And the Attorney General spent 5 hours deflecting, attacking questioners, and citing her predecessor. Goldman named the structure of it during his questioning. This is not a bureaucratic error. This is a pattern. Victims exposed, powerful names protected. And when Congress asks who made those decisions, The answer is always process, procedure, and the previous administration. Crockett named the specific consequence. You have 38,000 reasons to explain why the most powerful name in these files is the one whose pages are still missing, and you have given us 0 of them. Massie named the mechanism. Someone watched this hearing in real time and restored a redacted name within 40 minutes of it being publicly identified. That is not an accident. That is a monitoring operation. And it tells you that the decisions about what stays redacted and what gets restored are being made actively, in real time, by people who are watching what Congress does with the documents they release. 3 Republicans at this hearing pushed for accountability. 3 times, Bondi deflected. The pattern held. Raskin said it before the gavel came down. You acted with some mixture of staggering incompetence, cold indifference, and jaded cruelty toward more than 1,000 victims. This performance screams cover-up. The survivors in white stood up and walked out of a room where their names had been published and the names of the powerful had been protected. 31 victims named, the connected ones shielded. 38,000 appearances in the files, 30 pages still missing. 40 minutes to restore a name after it was caught on camera. 5 hours of testimony that produced no name, no accountability, and no answer to the question that every person in that room already knew how to ask. Who made these decisions? And why do the decisions keep protecting the same people? The hearing is over. The 30 pages are still missing. And the answer to that question is still waiting in a file that has not been released.